All right. All right, it's 6:09, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for waiting. I just wanted to make sure everyone that planned on coming still got to be part of the uh, presentation. My name is Tyler. I am Chickasaw and Caddo, and I am trying to revive a club on the downtown campus named NASU. It's Native Americans for Academic Success and Unity. Uh, it's a club that my supervisor, Vicki Baldwin, is very uh, dedicated to, and she's the advisor for the club as well. I am looking for some students who are interested in arranging more of these discussions and events, or even interviews with interesting people or departments across ASU and the community. But that's enough about myself. It looks like tonight we have a couple members of a club I'm also in called Indigenous Wellness Alliance. And we do a lot of work to try to raise awareness for different health topics in the Native community. And we do some volunteer work here and there. And we also have the pleasure of sharing our stage tonight with uh, Vanessa Brierty. I am sorry, I'm still learning last names a little bit. She's a certified health education specialist and works with the Indian health system. And she's also an ASU graduate, so go Sun Devils. So I believe I have Savannah and Alyssa, a couple of my co-facilitators for Indigenous Wellness Alliance here. And we'd love to share a little more with you. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Hello, I'm Savannah Castorena. I'm the facilitator of programming for Indigenous Wellness Alliance. I'm also a senior graduating this December. My major is in dietetics with a minor in American Indian Studies. And it's good to see the turnout. We've had low turnouts for a few of our meetings this semester, so I'm excited to have this discussion.
Me too. It's a great turnout tonight. We appreciate everyone for being here. And if you think of a good question, you can drop it in the chat at any point and we'll do our best to address it. It looks like Alyssa will be active in the chat tonight. Her microphone's not working, but she is a senior graduating this May and in the major of kinesiology. She's also our facilitator of documentation. And thank you, Savannah, for introducing yourself. So, like she said, it's been a weird semester for all of us. We're trying to transition back to in-person events, but a lot of people still love this online format. It's easy to attend from home. So I'm glad we can offer a little bit of both this semester. Savannah actually arranged in-person gathering that was pretty successful for taking care of her local community garden. And I thought that was a really great way for us to outreach to the community and make a difference. Vanessa, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, Goatsi Hopa Keto at Drashra. I am Vanessa Brierty. I'm from the Pueblo of Laguna. I am also a prevention educator with the Riverside San Bernardino County Indian Health at their Native American Resource Center. I'm also a academic associate for the College of Health Solutions at ASU, a recent graduate of ASU with a degree in health education and health promotion. And I recently was accepted into the master's program for Indigenous education. So I'll be starting that this spring. In addition to that, I am also a certified health education specialist. So thank you for having me here tonight.
Thank you for being here. Yeah, she was very proactive in wanting to be a part of Native American Heritage Month. And that's something that I feel that we did pretty successfully this month. There were a lot of great events. I am still working on my little ribbon skirt from that event as well. They were, I believe it was MMI, ASU, and Indigenous, as well as ASU through that event. So, oh yeah, there's been a lot of fun events this semester, and I'm glad this can be one of the ones to kind of relax to. Hopefully everyone's full of good food this weekend, and we can all think about how that food is nourishing us and what we can do to kind of eat a more indigenous and healthy diet. So that's a little bit of what we'll talk about today. And a lot of us are students, so on one hand, we love researching this stuff, but on the other hand, we're not experts. So we'll do our best to answer any questions, but if you have any specific questions, just drop them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer. So I wanted to give Savannah Nelson, not the Savannah introduced earlier, opportunity to talk about a recent event she had, but it looks like she's not able to make it tonight. I just want to point out that this will be a reoccurring event. So look out in the spring for another indigenizing the diet event. And yeah, it was a fantastic event. And she even had bags of native food for people to try and take home. I'm really excited to see how it comes out in the spring. So our other Savannah was also at this event and had a little slide about decolonization, which I feel is kind of at the heart of food sovereignty. So Savannah, how do you reclaim your indigenous identity through food?
So just to answer the question, I think the first step to reclaiming that identity is through awareness. And we do have a professor here by the name of Myla Carpio, and she's definitely more a master at the terms of colonization and decolonization. But in the PowerPoint presentation that we did this past Monday on indigenizing the diet, I felt it was necessary to kind of set the scene as to why we were having this conversation or this idea of reclaiming our diet. And it's a process of decolonization. And I know the word has become touchy over the past couple of years because we can use it in so many different terms. So again, to set the scene for this discussion, the way I see decolonization is through the reclaiming of certain things, whether that be the culture, the language, the identity, and it even goes down to the foods that we eat and rediscovering that by asking the elders what they remember eating growing up. I see that as a way of reclaiming our diet, recovering the words that they actually use to describe these foods in your indigenous language instead of using the American terms. But yeah, this kind of setup that I have on the slide, I actually got the steps from a Hawaiian rights activist and attorney. His name is Poka Lenui. I think I pronounced that right. But he said that colonization could simply be summed up into 5 steps, and so can the process of reclaiming our identity. So the first step was rediscovery and recovery. This is where we become aware of the ways in which we've been colonized through the exploitation and destruction of our culture, the land, and all of that. The second step is mourning. This is allowing us to express that loss and really grasping the magnitude that colonization has had on our cultures. And when we do express that loss, it's acknowledging that something was taken, but it also begins the healing process. So it's kind of reinforcing that we don't need to stay in this situation. We can shift our mentality from something was taken to look how far we've come, and we're still here to have the opportunity to reclaim and relearn what our ancestors already knew. So the next one is dreaming. We can just imagine the possibilities because we're shifting from surviving to thriving. And this is kind of where I'm at right now. I'm trying to dream up ways to strengthen that food sovereignty aspect of reclaiming the diet. Commitment, of course, is realizing that we have a responsibility not only to ourselves after the rediscovery in the morning and the dreaming, that we can't just say we're going to do it, but actually being an active participant in the process of reclaiming this Indigenous identity. And the way I see it, since I am a dietitian, nutritionist major, is through the food. And then, of course, the action, learning the language, eating the foods that are in the region that you're in. So an example that I had used was when you go to potlucks, try not to bring the processed foods or processed drinks. Try to bring water, fruits, or if you're even able to get indigenous foods that are in the area, that's a way you can take action. But yeah, this is super general concept, but I think it's super relevant for the process of moving forward and getting closer to practicing food sovereignty within our indigenous communities. And if I didn't say it before, my focus is more on prevention of type 2 diabetes, because during my Western education, I've learned that up to 90% of the type 2 diabetes diagnoses are preventable. The other 10% we have no control over. So I'm a firm believer that there's something there in reclaiming our diets to help drastically cut these chronic disease rates, specifically within our Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Savannah. I really loved what you had to say. I think that there is a strong connection with returning to Indigenous foods and better health. For those of you not as familiar with Indigenous diets, big tradition in my tribe, the Chickasaw, as well as quite a few other tribes, are the three sister plants. And this was a way they grew their crops, not in separate areas like we have now with just fields of grain, then fields of produce, trees all separated into their own areas. They grew corn, which served as the trellis for the beans they grew, and the beans provided shade to the squash that would grow on the ground. And this was a very sustainable practice and kept a lot of nutrients in the ground. And I believe it is followed at quite a few community gardens. So I wanted to give Vanessa Brierty a more general question, but she's also here to tell us a little bit about health as affected by nutrition, to give you more of the health education side that I think needs to be a little more of a focus for our Native communities. So with that, Vanessa, how does nutrition affect the Native American population?
Thanks, Tyler. And I just want to say thank you to Savannah as well for leading us with that. What does a decolonizing and reclaiming process look like? Because I think that's important from that Indigenous perspective, especially when we look at health education. As a certified health education specialist, part of my role is to implement those health prevention programs that we want to prevent those diseases and illnesses from being prevalent within our Indigenous communities, as well as reducing those risks, right? That's the focus as a certified health education specialist, among other things that I do. And with that approach, when we think about nutrition and how it affects our Native American population, it's such a broad subject and it can be broken down into many different things. And for me, when I read this, the approach that I'm taking on it is just a reflection process. You know, what happened, what caused it to happen, and what can we do differently moving forward, right? And although I am a certified health education specialist, I do incorporate a lot of those traditional cultural practices in my work, because I know that we lead where I work at with culture is prevention, right? Having that foundation will prevent these things. They will reduce those risks. And so with that concept and that approach, when I think of nutrition in Native American communities, I think of that historical perspective. If we look back historically, we have a lot of systems and structures that have been put into place that create barriers for Native Americans to access those nutritious foods. When we think about that, I can relate it to forced relocation, right? So Native Americans being taken off of their Indigenous lands and put onto other lands that they weren't really familiar with, but we adapted to, right? And then I think of boarding schools, the boarding school systems where we have children who are being relocated to thousands, hundreds of miles away from their families and being introduced to a new diet that they weren't familiar with. Even more recently, we have the USDA with their initiatives and their push to incorporate those processed as what we know as commodity foods, right? That's what I grew up eating, and they're delicious, but they're not the best for us. So when we think about that and we think about all that introduction of those processed foods that didn't meet our nutritional needs, we're thinking of flour, we're thinking of sugars, canned foods that are high in sodium, high fructose corn syrups, high levels of processed oils and fats, chemical additives as well. And just some additional historical perspective, when our Dene relatives went on their longest walk, they were given flour, they were fed sugar, and a lot of them died from eating that because the flour they were not used to. So it basically sat in their stomachs and it didn't process. And for anybody, if we go out and we eat, our body has a natural reaction to something that we eat. Maybe it doesn't react very well with us, maybe it does. And so that's our body saying, hey, this doesn't work with me right now. And that's what a lot of our Indigenous relatives have dealt with. And so even including, I know this screen shows a picture of a food desert. Food deserts are, we don't have supermarkets within a mile. And if you think about that, a mile isn't that far. And where I'm from at the Pueblo of Laguna, it takes me about 20, 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes to get to the grocery store, and that's just one way. And so it's about a 13-mile one-way drive to get to the supermarket. And that's just a mini market. It's not packed with organic foods or fresh vegetables. The vegetables that are sold at the grocery store that I do shop at, I remember going in and seeing a pound of grapes for $6. And that is not going to be something that our communities can afford, right? And that's not even to say a traditional food source as well. So from these introduction of different foods and refined sugars and carbohydrates and all of these things, it created a more sedentary lifestyle. And that included the relocation to different reservations. We weren't going out and we weren't gathering. We weren't going out and we weren't hunting. We weren't foraging. We weren't being as resourceful as we normally would be. Were we able to adapt to that? Yes, we were, but our sedentary lifestyles became much more prominent. And with that, we have that introduction of obesity. Obesity is one of the main health diseases that Native Americans face today. It's the highest, one of the highest diseases that Native Americans have with all ethnic and other races. And from obesity, we do know that stems diabetes, heart disease, and even cancer. And when we think about diabetes, it's not just affecting our elders, it's affecting our children. And I've heard growing up, oh, well, I'm just going to get diabetes because my grandma had it or my cousin has it. And so we have this notion, preconceived notion that that's just going to happen to us. But now moving forward, that doesn't have to happen to us because we do have resources. We are recultivating that lifestyle to bring back in that traditional food use, right? And just to give you an idea that type 2 diabetes, which is usually called adult onset diabetes, which takes time to, infiltrate your body system and go through your liver and your pancreas and deplete that insulin source. There are children who are the ages of 10 to 19 who are developing that adult onset diabetes. So we have younger generations who are coming up with these diseases that are being impacted by those systems and structures that have been put into place to impact, again, to create those barriers that we have as Indigenous people to access those nutritional foods. A little bit more into that, heart disease is one of the leading causes of deaths for Native Americans, which is really unfortunate when we think about it. And our Northern Plains relatives have a 58% greater heart disease mortality rate compared to the Caucasian population. And when we think of that, that's a big number, even though we think of 58% maybe out of 100%, right? That's still more than half. That's a lot of relatives that are being impacted by heart disease. And also heart disease comes into play when we have that introduction of processed meats, also alcohol consumption, excess fat buildup, which is that obesity, going back to that. And even with that, Native Americans are at a higher risk for developing colorectal cancer, which is colon cancer. And unfortunately, again, going back to those systems and structures that have been put in place, we know that Indian Health Services is an underfunded agency that where a lot of us go to seek those support services. Knowing that IHS is an underfunded service, they do not have the funds or the access to implement colorectal screening. And so without that knowledge or having to outsource puts our people in more of a bind, right? Because we know that for them to access these spaces, they have to go off the reservation, they have to drive, they have to find a ride even to get into town to go to these appointments. So those barriers continue to build up. But again, I go back to that adversity, right? We're working through that. We're coming into a space where we're becoming more educated. We're including those healthy foods around us. And I know that as Native people, we approach our lifestyles holistically. So we think of our bodies as emotional component. And when we think of that, I relate it to that medicine wheel approach. Maybe some people's medicine wheels look a little different, or maybe the 4 components that I relate to a lot is the mental, spiritual, emotional, and food. We don't think that it really impacts our mental state, right? We just think, oh, it's just my body. I'm getting the nutrition I need to function throughout the day. And it's known that our brain functions off of 20% of our caloric needs. Again, that's a big organ that's functioning that needs that 20% of those nutritional values. And if our communities are only eating commodity foods that are sugar-based, that are high in refined white flours, or those commodity cans of or commodity cheese, right? That 20% that our brain needs to function will gradually deplete. And with that, the depletion and our ability to function throughout the day increases our risks for dementia. It increases our risks for Alzheimer's. And these symptoms start to appear because we get chronic inflammation in our brain cells that, again, come from those systems and structures that have been put into place for our own people. And we know that our brains are vital to our own functions. And even if we're off a few percentage, we're not going to be able to be productive. Our dopamine, our serotonin, our oxytocin, the endorphins, all those feel-good receptors and feel-good things that we need to function throughout the day are going to be depleted. So that increases our risk for depression, that increases our risk for mental health illnesses. And not only that, we know that with mental health, it puts us more at risk to engage in unhealthy behaviors, right? So nutrition is a very, very important part of our traditional ways, our traditional food sources. And going back to that mental, spiritual, and emotional approach is for you might have an emotional reaction or a thought or a feeling that comes up when you eat your traditional foods, right? When you smell your traditional foods, or maybe even when you think of that, right? Sometimes I have here with me some Indian tea, what we call suchawa. And this, you just brew it, but every time I brew it, I smell my grandma. I smell home. I'm comforted by this. So that mental and emotional approach that we utilize is increased. And then my physical ability to be more productive throughout the day heightens a little bit more. And so some of the things that we can do moving forward, knowing that we have these connections to these traditional foods, we have these connections, we have resources available to us, is to be engaging in those. If you're not sure, haven't heard about, there's a really great book called The Pueblo Food Experience. I don't know if you can see it. But this was done by a fellow Pueblo woman as well, who engaged 14 participants, and they were ages from six years old to 65 years old. So that's a very large range of people. And she engaged them for 90 days. They went and they ate traditional foods. They went and gathered traditional foods. They participated in traditional food making together as a community. And after those 90 days, there was a incredibly huge decrease in their diabetes, their sugar levels lowered exponentially, their weight decreased, their cholesterol decreased, but most importantly, their mental state improved. And we know that no matter how much good food we put in our bodies, we could have a dietitian that says, hey, you know, eat this, 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 and lay it out for us. If we don't have that mental and emotional component to support that, we're not going to be successful, and we're not going to be proactive, and we're not going to be able to carry on those traditions that have been handed down to us. And for me, I do feel that we have struggled a lot with historical trauma. We have struggled a lot with those systems and structures that have been put into place to basically erase us, right? And moving forward, how do we heal from that? How do we use that healing to move forward? And that's through food. That's revitalizing that food sources. That's going out and gathering. That's bringing your community, because we are a community-based people. We come from clans. We have huge families. And so bringing those systems together will continue that health, continue that happiness, and continue to revitalize those nutritional foods that we have. Even a little, I guess, side note feedback, it wasn't until the 1960s that there was a food source called amaranth, which is very good in fiber. You can pop it like popcorn. You can use it as a filler like quinoa. It's a really great food source that was banned up until 1960. So again, if we look at those historical implications or barriers that have been set in place, all of those laws, you know, we couldn't practice our cultural traditions until the late 1970s. And so even with that, even our food sources weren't available to us. So again, going forward, it's important to find the area that you're in, see what foods are there for you. Right now, it's winter time, so a lot of food sources are dormant, but we do know that we have a lot of cruciferous foods that we can grow, like broccoli, cauliflower, lettuce. Even if you don't have access to a farm where you're at, you can grow these things on your own porch. You can have a little tomato jar or have a little lettuce bed that you can use and eat from. Additionally, connect with the local tribes that you're around, see what food sources that they have available. There's a lot of tribes that have seed banks that you can take those seeds that have been used for thousands of years. The Anasazi bean, which is a bean that's used for, it's used everywhere, but where it was found was in, archaeologists found it in and it had just been dried out. So they were able to bring that back. And so there's a big repopulation of that Anasazi bean. So those traditional foods are still there. They're still available to us, but it's just finding where they're at, finding the location that you're in so you can go forward and use those resources that are available to you and reconnect. And that, again, not only improves your nutrition, your physical health, but it's going to improve your mental, your emotional, and even that spiritual connection that you have, not only with yourself here, but with your ancestors that came before you. So I think that's pretty much all I have right now. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to offer or answer anything. Oh, Tyler, you're muted.
Thank you. I was just thanking Vanessa for that wonderful presentation. And yeah, you covered so much, but I think I'm very impressed with how many topics and how many different aspects of your health do come back to what you're eating. As a nutrition major, we hear from our first class, you are what you eat, but I think bringing a new cultural understanding to that really helps us reclaim some of our Native identity. And for those looking for native seeds, those are there's a program with the Phoenix Public Libraries where Native Seeds, an organization dedicated to bringing back the natural plants and produce that were originally grown in this area. They have them available at any library. So another great reason to get a library card. So Vanessa, as someone that has made it through the whole tangle that is getting a bachelor's degree, and someone who's actively working at the IHS, I wanted to see what advice you had for Indigenous health students.
I think my biggest advice for Indigenous health students is to think about your ancestors. Think about them as you do your work, because that work is healing. That's not only going to heal from back then, it's also going to heal moving forward. What is it? What's your focus? What is your drive to help support and guide our communities? Because there's a lot of spaces where the education is necessary, and that's just coming along somebody and saying, hey, do you want to go gather with me today? Or what are your thoughts on maybe putting in a new bike path? Or how about we go for a hike in a traditional area that has those cultural resources associated with them? And so that would be my advice, is consider your ancestors and what you're doing. Consider that healing that we want so badly to happen for our communities, right? I don't want to say this in the wrong way, but we've suffered for long enough that it's now that time for healing. And that healing can be so proactive, it can be so protective, it can be so great for yourself and for other people. So definitely I would lead with your ancestors and lead with that healing component.
Thank you. I think that's a really great advice. Think of your ancestors, and that's something I'll definitely try to carry going forward. Yeah, I know that my ancestors definitely survived a lot and have been through a lot, and sometimes thinking of that is extra motivation personally. I'm in a pretty tough semester with organic chemistry and some nutrition classes. And yeah, there have definitely been times where I at least felt like giving up for a while, or just got a little overtired from doing homework late into the night. But thinking of my ancestors and what they've been through is definitely motivating. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat if you
I have a question.
Great.
So it just goes back to, how would you define, or what direction do you see food sovereignty taking within the next 2 to 5 years, Vanessa?
I think that food sovereignty, it's moving towards the forefront of that protective factor for our Indigenous communities. I think that there's a big push to regain those food sources and those food systems and reclaim them. But how do we do that? I think for me, that approach is looking at it as, how do we do that in the space that we're in today, right? We look at Phoenix, and Phoenix was a huge agricultural center. There were fields throughout that Phoenix Valley, but obviously they're no longer there. So how do we regain that? How do we find a space to reconnect to that, that we can embrace that? And food sovereignty, when it comes down to it, is being able to, on your own, cultivate those foods, to have that will to do what we need to do when it comes to our own nutrition, right? And that's through education, that's through sharing with your friends. Maybe it's taking a modification of, rather than going to get that cheeseburger today, maybe I'll make something at home. Maybe I'll pick a recipe from my grandma's list and modify that. I do a lot of that cooking where I love blue corn, but blue corn doesn't taste that great when it's by itself. So I'll put in some agave nectar. I'll top it with pomegranate seeds. Engaging the kids. I do a lot with my nieces and nephews. I try and teach them what our traditional foods look like. Or even if it's just asking that question, what is your approach to this? How would you manage this situation? What are your thoughts on this? And getting into that community, having those conversations is really important to not only seeing food sovereignty continue on, but to make sure that it's done respectfully to the people that land is you're on, and to be able just overall to continue that practice, right? I don't know if that answered the right question, but.
Yeah, it was more of your perspective, but yeah, I like that. Thank you.
I think for me, it's more of a collective approach, just because that's what I tend to lead with, is the community. That's my community. How can I best support them? So asking those questions from them, how can we make this sustain? And I've noticed specifically with during COVID, a lot of our tribes went back to those traditional ways, because we didn't have the hustle and bustle of work. We were able to go to the cornfields. We were able to cultivate those foods. And a lot of the work has to come from our own communities. We want to be sustainable. We want to have that for our communities, within our communities. And I was able to observe that back home with growing of foods and farming, and being able to see everybody feed everybody else. That was pretty cool. So things like that, practices like that, are great to engage in to make sure that food sovereignty continues on.
Thank you. You have just really the best perspective on this as someone who is very knowledgeable about both the cultural side and the health side of everything. I'm very impressed, and I was wondering what was on your table for Thanksgiving or fall harvest or anything this weekend?
Well, our power was out for 2 days.
Oh
So
no.
it was really nice, actually. So I live in Southern California, so I'm not back home on the reservation. So I live in an urban environment. So it was actually really nice to not have electricity, because it forced us to put everything down, turn on some candles, light the lanterns, and just sit and be with each other. So if I could say anything was on the table, it was a lot of love and a lot of respect and a lot of communication. So that's how we spent our holiday.
That's fantastic to hear. And a very positive look on what could be a disastrous circumstance for a lot of people, not having power for a couple days. And as far as that menu goes, I can't think of anything better. So I don't see any questions in the chat. I wanted to make sure participants had a chance to ask any questions they'd like. So if anyone is interested, go ahead and unmute yourself or type in the chat any questions you have.
I didn't really have a question, but I have a comment. I just really liked, thinking about healing through our ancestral foods. And I feel like it's so often, or it can be like overlooked easily, especially like trying to connect to your heritage or your community. Like food is such a bonding thing already, and to have like to go back to those roots of like harvesting with community or like being with community. I really found I really like that. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a great comment. And once again, much appreciation for Vanessa for being with us today. We would love to hear more from you in the spring. So hopefully we can collaborate on something else. If you didn't already have a chance, please fill out the attendance sheet and let us know if you're interested in future events through that form. This is something I would love to continue in the spring, and I'd love to highlight a lot of great organizations that are both in ASU and the greater Native community. Last week we had Cahokia Art Space for an interview, and those ladies are very impressive too. So go ahead and sign up through email if you want our updates, and I'll be posting these chats for anyone that would love to share them with family or friends in the future. I think we even had the ASU preparatory in Casa Grande ask for a recording of one of our videos. So it's just a good way to refresh on ideas such as food sovereignty or other topics. So thank you everyone for coming. I'm gonna wrap things up since we're getting pretty close to 7 here. If anyone has any final comments, feel free to add them. Or if anyone wants to stay on and just chat, feel free. But I will be stopping our recording now.